My tomatoes needed water. That was the only thought in my head on the morning everything changed. Not about money, not about the past, not about a man I hadn't spoken to in 20 years. Just the tomatoes. 6 plants in terracotta pots along the porch railing, their leaves starting to curl at the edges the way they do when they've been waiting too long. I filled the old green watering can from the spigot near the steps and made my rounds the way I did every morning. Slow, unhurried. The kind of pace that comes naturally when you've stopped trying to outrun anything. My name is Dorothy Ann Whitfield. I'm 66 years old and I live in a rented house on the outskirts of Cookeville, Tennessee, where the road turns to gravel about a quarter mile past the Methodist Church and the nearest grocery store is 20 minutes away if you don't hit the light on Route 70. It's not a house anyone would notice driving past. White siding that needs a fresh coat, a front porch with 2 wooden chairs and a side table I found at an estate sale. A yard that's more wildflower than lawn. I've lived here going on 9 years now. Before this, there was a duplex in Murfreesboro, and before that, a small apartment behind a laundromat where my son Caleb and I spent 4 years eating soup from cans and watching reruns of Jeopardy on a television with a bent antenna. We didn't have much in those days, but we had enough, and I've come to believe that enough, when you really mean it, is a kind of wealth most people never find. My days follow a rhythm that suits me. I water the plants in the morning. I walk to the end of the road and back before breakfast. I read in the afternoons, paperbacks mostly, the kind with soft spines and someone else's pencil marks in the margins, bought from the Goodwill on Highway 111 for $1 or $2 apiece. On Sundays I go to the little Baptist church at the bend in the road, not because I've worked out all my theology, but because I love the singing, and I love the way Pastor Jim says everyone's name when they walk through the door, like each person arriving is a small miracle worth acknowledging. My neighbor Nora Patton comes by most mornings around 8. She's 79, sharp as a tack, and never met a silence she couldn't fill. She brings her own coffee in a thermos because she says mine is too weak, and we sit on the porch and talk about whatever comes up. The weather, the birds, which neighbor got a new truck, which politician said something foolish. She's been doing this for 6 years. I can't imagine mornings without her. That Tuesday in April, Nora was settled into her chair before I'd finished watering, her thermos already open, her reading glasses pushed up into her white hair. "You've got a look," she said. "I don't have a look. You've been staring at that same tomato plant for 3 minutes. I moved the watering can to the next pot. I'm being thorough." Nora made a sound that meant she didn't believe me but wasn't going to press. That was one of the things I loved about her. She knew when to wait. The truth was, I did have a look. I'd woken that morning with a vague unease I couldn't name, the kind that sits at the base of your sternum and doesn't announce itself. I'd been having a dream, not a bad one, just old. Raymond at the piano. The back room of the White Note on a Friday night, cigarette smoke and cheap wine and someone clapping off beat in the corner. Raymond's hands moving across the keys like they already knew where they were going. I hadn't dreamed about Raymond in years. I pushed it aside and sat down with my coffee. The phone rang at 10:30. I almost didn't answer. The number wasn't in my contacts, and I'd been burned enough times by calls about my car's extended warranty that I'd developed a habit of letting unknowns go to voicemail. But something made me pick up. Some small, quiet instinct that said this one is different. "Is this Dorothy Ann Whitfield?" A woman's voice, professional, measured. Speaking. "Mrs. Whitfield, my name is Patricia Hale. I'm calling on behalf of Harmon & Associates, an estate law firm based in Nashville. I'm reaching out regarding the estate of Raymond George Whitfield." I sat down on the porch step without meaning to. "I'm sorry," I said. "Did you say estate?" "Yes, ma'am." A brief, practiced pause. "I'm sorry to inform you that Mr. Raymond Whitfield passed away on February 14th. You've been listed by name as an individual in the execution of his will, and your presence has been specifically requested at the formal reading." February 14th, Valentine's Day. I don't know why that detail landed the way it did. Raymond had never been sentimental about holidays. Forgot our anniversary twice. Once gave me a card he'd clearly bought at a gas station. But dying on Valentine's Day felt like something he might have chosen deliberately, if such things could be chosen. A final flourish. A last note held just a beat too long. "Mrs. Whitfield? I'm here." I pressed my free hand flat against my thigh to stop it from shaking. "I'm sorry. Are you certain you have the right person? Dorothy Whitfield, formerly of Nashville?" We divorced in 1998. Yes, ma'am. You were listed personally and specifically by Mr. Whitfield. There's no question of identification. I asked her twice more. She confirmed both times, patient and kind about it. When I hung up, I stayed on the porch step and looked out at the yard for a long time. The finches were going at the bird feeder. The wind was moving through the tulip poplar at the corner of the fence. Everything was exactly the same as it had been 20 minutes ago, and also nothing was. Raymond remembered my name. Nora appeared in the doorway behind me. She must have heard something in the silence. Dot? What happened? I looked up at her. Raymond died. She came and sat beside me on the step, close enough that our shoulders touched. She didn't say she was sorry, which was the right thing, because she knew the story well enough to understand that sorry was complicated. After a moment, she said, And apparently he left me something in his will. Nora was quiet for a few seconds, then, Well, he always did know how to make an entrance, even the exits. I almost laughed. Almost. Let me tell you about Raymond Whitfield before the money. Before the company, before the properties, before the suits that fit too well, and the name that showed up in the Nashville Business Journal. Before all of that, there was a man who played piano like it was the only honest thing he knew how to do. I met him in the summer of 1981. I was 23 and working as a bookkeeper for a small restaurant on 2nd Avenue in Nashville called Rudy's Southern Table. It was the kind of place with red-checked tablecloths and sweet tea in mason jars, the kind that's been replaced 100 times over by exposed brick and craft cocktails. I liked it there. The work was simple, the hours were regular, and the owner, a round-faced woman named Gladys, let me eat dinner at the end of every shift. Raymond walked in on a Thursday in July wearing a white linen shirt that was too big in the shoulders and carrying a roll of sheet music under his arm, like a man carrying something precious. He asked Gladys if he could play the old upright in the corner on Friday nights. She asked what he charged. He said he'd do it for meals. She said she'd think about it. He came back the next day and played one song in the middle of a lunch service, unrequested and unannounced, and every person in that restaurant stopped what they were doing. A woman in a red cardigan set down her fork. Two businessmen in the middle of an argument just stopped arguing. I was at the host stand with a stack of menus and I forgot to breathe. When he finished, Gladys hired him on the spot. I watched him from behind the register that first Friday night. He didn't perform. That's what I remember most about it. He just played. There was no showmanship, no working the room, no checking whether people were watching. He sat down, found the music somewhere inside himself, and let it out. I'd never seen anyone do anything that way, so completely and without apology. He came to my register for a glass of water during his break. "Did you like it?" he asked. "I liked watching you not care who was listening," I said. He looked at me for a second, really looked, like I'd said something worth considering. "That's the only way to play," he said. We talked for 20 minutes. Gladys had to come tell me there were customers waiting. We were married in the spring of 1983. Neither of us had much to speak of. My dress was from a consignment shop on Charlotte Avenue, cream-colored, tea-length, $38. Raymond's suit didn't quite fit across the shoulders, which he said was intentional, and I said was wishful thinking. And we laughed about it all through the ceremony in the small chapel on Gallatin Road, with 17 people in attendance, including Gladys, who cried through the entire thing. We bought a house that fall on Maple Ridge Drive, small, brick, 1 story, with a magnolia tree in the front yard and a kitchen barely big enough for 2 people to stand in at the same time. We paid for it with a combination of my savings and the contents of a jar Raymond had been filling with cash for 3 years, dollar by dollar, from every gig he'd ever played. The jar had a piece of masking tape on the side that said someday. That was the house where we were happiest. In the spring of 1984, we opened the White Note. It was Raymond's dream first, but it became mine too in the making of it. A small cafe in East Nashville, 2 rooms and a front porch, secondhand furniture we painted ourselves, a chalkboard menu on the wall, and Raymond's piano in the corner. We served coffee and the sweet rolls I baked at 4 in the morning before opening. On Friday nights, Raymond would play, and sometimes other musicians would drift in with their instruments. And for a few hours, the White Note became something that didn't have a name. Not a bar, not a concert hall, just a place where music happened and people felt it. I kept the books, ordered the supplies, managed the staff. Two college kids named Terrence and Joy who were so obviously in love with each other that watching them navigate the tiny kitchen was both painful and hilarious. I handled every number, every invoice, every tax form. Raymond handled the music, the vision, the way the room felt. We were good at it, not separately, together. Caleb was born in 1986, and Raymond cried when he held him for the first time. Not politely, not just a glisten in the eyes, but genuinely and unashamedly, standing in the hospital room in a flannel shirt with motor oil on the sleeve because he'd rushed straight from a repair job on his truck. He held our son against his chest and said very quietly, "This kid is going to hear so much music." Those were the years I go back to when I need to remember who we were before we became who we became. It didn't happen all at once. That's the thing about losing something slowly. You keep expecting it to stop. It started with a man named Bill Hartley, a commercial real estate investor who used to come into the White Note on Saturday mornings. He had the kind of confidence that fills a room before the person does, and he liked Raymond immediately, liked his vision, liked the way people responded to him. He started buying Raymond coffee and talking about opportunity. "The music is great, Ray, but have you thought about what you could build?" Raymond came home one evening in the spring of 1989 and told me he'd been offered a partnership on a small commercial property on Nolensville Pike, a strip of retail spaces that needed renovation and new tenants. Hartley would put up the capital. Raymond would manage the project. "What about the cafe?" I asked. "The cafe stays," he said. "This is just on the side." It was never just on the side. Within a year, Raymond was coming home past midnight 3 nights a week. The cafe started losing what made it the cafe. Raymond's presence, his attention, the sense that this place mattered to him above everything else. The piano sat quiet on Friday nights more often than not. I hired a substitute player, a gentle older man named Earl, who was technically proficient and entirely forgettable. I watched Raymond change the way you watch weather changing through a window. Gradual, undeniable, and from a place where you have no say in it. The briefcase appeared. Then the suits. Then the phone that was always face down on the table. He stopped singing in the shower. He stopped holding my hand in parking lots. He stopped asking about my day with the particular quality of interest that means you actually want to know. In the fall of 1991, I found a receipt in his coat pocket. Dinner for 2 at a restaurant in Franklin that I had never been to. The date was a Tuesday. He told me he was in Memphis. I put the receipt back. I told myself there was an explanation. There wasn't. I knew there wasn't. But I stayed 14 more months, doing the math of staying the way women do, adding up what I'd lose, what Caleb would lose, whether the damage of leaving might somehow be larger than the damage of remaining. I filled a journal, then another. I baked more than we could sell. I refinished the floors in the back bedroom because the work of it gave my hands something to do besides shake. The morning I left, Caleb was 12 years old, and Raymond was at a conference in Memphis, a real one this time, which felt almost worse somehow. There was no confrontation, no final scene. I packed 2 suitcases and a box of books, left Raymond a note on the kitchen table that said what it needed to say in 2 sentences, buckled Caleb into the front seat, and drove away from Maple Ridge Drive without looking in the rearview mirror. I kept that promise to myself for 26 years. The divorce was quiet and miserable in the particular way of things that were once full of love. Raymond didn't fight me on custody. He didn't fight me on much at all. What he did do, on the advice of his lawyer, was negotiate away my stake in the growing business ventures in exchange for the house, which I subsequently sold to pay off what we owed, because staying in that house alone with a 12-year-old and a ghost was not something I was capable of. I signed the papers on a Wednesday morning, shook hands with 2 lawyers I never wanted to see again, and walked out into a gray October day with my son's hand in mine and nothing in my account but what I'd managed to save in the preceding year. Caleb came with me without question. He climbed into the car with his backpack and his blue hoodie and didn't ask why we were leaving. I don't know if that was wisdom or shock. Possibly both. The years that followed were hard in the specific way that hard years are. Not dramatic, just daily. Small apartments and odd jobs and the particular mathematics of choosing between the electric bill and new school shoes. I managed a diner off I-40 for 6 years. I did bookkeeping for small businesses on weekends. I showed up to every parent-teacher conference, every school play, every dentist appointment. I raised that boy. He was mine. Until he wasn't. Caleb turned 14 and Raymond started calling more, sending things, a new gaming console at Christmas, a plane ticket to Nashville for spring break, a summer at a leadership camp in Colorado, each offering a little shinier than the last, each one widening the gap between what Raymond could give him and what I could. At 17, Caleb told me he wanted to move in with his father. "He understands the way the world works, Mom," he said. "I want to learn that." I nodded. I let him go. I told myself it was the right thing. That night I sat at the kitchen table until 3 in the morning, and I didn't cry, and I didn't call anyone, and I just sat there until the sky outside the window turned from black to gray to the particular pale color of a morning that doesn't care what happened the night before. After that, Caleb and I became what I call calendar contact people. Holidays, birthdays, the occasional text that started with "Hey, just checking in" and ended with a few exchanged sentences that were perfectly polite and felt like talking to a very courteous stranger. He married Savannah Aldridge 4 years ago, a sharp, beautiful woman from a wealthy Virginia family who looked at everything the way an appraiser looks at property, assessing its value before deciding whether to engage. She had never been unkind to me. She had also never once been warm. The reading of the will was scheduled for a Thursday, 2 weeks after Patricia Hale's call. The morning of, I stood in front of my closet for a long time. I didn't own anything that could compete with whatever Caleb and Savannah would be wearing, and I wasn't going to try. I chose a navy dress I'd bought for a friend's retirement party 2 years ago, low heels, pearl earrings that had belonged to my mother. Simple, clean, like myself. Nora was waiting on the porch when I came out. She looked me up and down, slowly and deliberately, the way she did when she was forming an official opinion. "Good," she said. "Good? You look like yourself. Don't let them make you feel like that's not enough." She pointed at me with her thermos. "Straight back. Don't apologize for being in the room." I kissed her cheek. She waved me off like I was being foolish. The drive to Nashville took 2 hours. I didn't turn on the radio. I thought about Raymond. Not the Raymond of the last decades. Not the Raymond of the newspapers and the Whitfield Property Group annual reports. But the one from before. The one with the too big linen shirt and the roll of sheet music. The one who played piano like it was the only honest thing he knew how to do. I thought about why he would have remembered my name after all this time. I thought about what it might mean. I told myself not to expect anything. The offices of Harmon and Associates were on the 14th floor of a building downtown, all glass and stone and the kind of lobby that makes you walk differently the moment you step into it. I parked in the deck across the street and sat in my car for a few minutes, watching people in good shoes move with purpose across the sidewalk below. Then I straightened my back, Nora's voice in my head, and went inside. Caleb and Savannah were already in the waiting room when I arrived. Caleb stood when he saw me. He was wearing a charcoal suit with a pocket square, his dark hair neat, his posture the kind that comes from years of boardrooms and presentations. He looked like Raymond at 40, which hit me somewhere I wasn't prepared for. Savannah remained seated. She looked up from her phone, took me in from hem to earring, and then looked at Caleb with an expression I wasn't meant to see but did. Caleb stepped toward me, close enough to speak quietly. "Mom," not a greeting, a statement of mild surprise like he'd half expected me not to come. "Caleb, you didn't have to make the trip," he said. The words were almost considerate. Almost. "I was specifically requested," he said. Something flickered in his expression, a recalibration. "Right. Well," he glanced toward the reception desk. "I'm sure it's a formality. Estate things sometimes require acknowledgement from all parties. It doesn't necessarily mean—" "I know what it may or may not mean," I said pleasantly. He stopped, looked at me for a moment. Then Savannah spoke from her chair, not looking up from her phone, her voice carrying precisely as far as it needed to. "I still don't understand why they'd have her come all the way up here for a formality." The "here" landed where she intended it to. I looked at Savannah steadily. She met my eyes briefly, then returned to her phone. I found a seat across the room and folded my hands in my lap and looked at the abstract painting on the wall. Blue and gray shapes that didn't resolve into anything, and waited. A few minutes later, a young woman in a charcoal blazer appeared in the doorway. "The Whitfield party?" she said. "Mr. Harmon will see you now." Caleb stood and straightened his jacket. Savannah put her phone away. I rose, smoothed my dress, and followed them down the hallway. The last thing I noticed before we turned the corner was Savannah leaning close to Caleb, her voice low. "She's not getting anything." He was very clear about that when we met with him last month. I kept walking. I kept my back straight. And I thought, Raymond, whatever you've done, I hope you knew what you were doing. Attorney Gerald Harmon was not what I expected. I had built a picture of him during the drive up. The kind of lawyer who works for men like Raymond, polished and precise, whose job is to protect money and the people who have it. I expected someone cold, someone whose courtesy was a performance. What I found instead was a man of about 60 with silver hair trimmed neatly above his ears, round tortoiseshell glasses, and the unhurried manner of someone who had sat in rooms like this one so many times that he'd long since stopped being impressed by the tension in them. He stood when we entered, shook each of our hands, and gestured to the chairs without ceremony. The room itself was quiet and serious. A long table of dark walnut, 6 chairs, a pitcher of water in the center that nobody touched. One wall was lined with legal volumes. On the credenza behind Harmon's chair sat a neat stack of folders, a closed laptop, and a tablet in a black case that I noticed but didn't yet understand. Caleb took the chair at the near end of the table, the one that positioned him slightly apart, the one that said I belong at the head of things. Savannah settled beside him, crossed her ankles, opened a small leather notebook. I sat across from them, which put me directly in Harmon's line of sight when he took his own chair. He set his glasses on his nose, opened the top folder with both hands, and looked at each of us in turn. "Thank you for coming," he said. "I know this isn't easy, regardless of the circumstances. I'll move through this efficiently, but I ask that you allow me to finish each section completely before responding. There's an order to this that matters." Caleb nodded with the brisk confidence of a man who expected good news delivered clearly. Savannah had her pen ready. I put my hands in my lap and looked at Gerald Harmon and thought, he already knows how this ends. There was something in the set of his mouth, not a smile exactly, more like the controlled expression of a man holding a door closed until the right moment. "This is the last will and testament of Raymond George Whitfield," Harmon began, "signed and notarized on October 9th of last year, witnessed by 2 independent parties, and certified in accordance with Tennessee state law." He paused briefly. "Mr. Whitfield also left supplementary materials which I'll present following the formal reading. I'll ask that we proceed in sequence." He turned to the first section. "To my son, Caleb James Whitfield." Caleb's posture, already straight, seemed to organize itself further. A man receiving something he'd earned. "I leave the residential property located at 4820 Brentwood Hills Court, Brentwood, Tennessee, along with all furnishings and personal effects contained therein. I additionally leave the sum of $500,000 to be transferred from my personal investment accounts within 90 days of the date of this reading." Savannah's pen moved. Caleb gave a small, almost imperceptible nod. The nod of a man who'd been expecting more, but was prepared to be patient about the order of delivery. Harmon continued without pausing. "These bequests are subject to the following condition. Within 90 days of this reading, Caleb James Whitfield must submit to and fully cooperate with an independent financial audit of Whitfield Property Group, conducted by a firm to be appointed by this office. This audit will review all internal transactions from January of the preceding 4 fiscal years." The pen stopped moving. Caleb's head came up slowly. "I'm sorry?" Harmon looked at him over his glasses. "An independent audit, conducted by a third party appointed by this office, reviewing 4 years of internal financial records. Your full cooperation is required as a condition of receiving the bequest." "He put an audit condition in my inheritance?" Caleb's voice was careful, controlled, but something behind his eyes had shifted. "He did." "Why would he—" Caleb stopped himself, recalibrated. "We can discuss the reasoning. What happens if the audit identifies irregularities?" Harmon turned one page. "If the audit identifies unauthorized financial transactions, both the property and the monetary bequest are forfeited and redirected to the Raymond Whitfield Foundation for Arts Education. Additionally, the findings would be submitted to the relevant regulatory bodies." The room was very quiet for a moment. Savannah had set her pen down. Caleb was looking at the table in front of him with the expression of a man doing rapid internal calculations, the kind that don't show on the face but change the temperature of the air around a person. "Moving forward," Harmon said calmly, and turned to the next page. "To my former wife, Dorothy Ann Whitfield." I had told myself I wasn't expecting anything. I had told myself this on the drive up, in the parking deck, In the elevator, every time Savannah's voice found a new way to remind me I didn't belong in this room. I had built a careful, practical wall around any possibility of expectation because I had learned, slowly, over 26 years of learning, that expectation is just disappointment with better posture. I was not prepared. I leave Dorothy Ann Whitfield's 60% controlling interest in Whitfield Property Group, including full voting rights and board authority, effective immediately upon execution of this will. Caleb's head turned toward me. I additionally leave her the residential property at 44 Maple Ridge Drive, Nashville, Tennessee, the first home we purchased together, along with all improvements made to the property since that time. Savannah made a sound, not a word, just a sound. Finally, I leave Dorothy Ann Whitfield the entirety of the Whitfield Family Trust, established in her name in 2001, currently valued at $42 million in liquid assets. The number went into the room and sat there. I heard it. I processed it the way you process something in a language you once knew well, but haven't spoken in a long time, recognizing the shape of it before the meaning arrives. $42 million, in a trust established in my name, in 2001, 3 years after the divorce. That's, Caleb started and then stopped, because there wasn't a sentence that fit what he wanted to say. Savannah found hers first. That's not possible, she said. Her voice was very precise. There must be a more recent document, something superseding this. This is the most recent document, Harmon said. Signed last October. We met with you in August. Savannah leaned forward. Raymond met with this office in August, and at that time, Mrs. Whitfield. Harmon's voice didn't rise, but it acquired a quality that ended the sentence. What was discussed in previous consultations is confidential. What is in this document is what governs. Caleb turned to look at me fully. His face had gone through several things in the last 30 seconds and had arrived at something I hadn't seen on him since he was a teenager. Raw, undefended confusion. You knew about this, he said. It wasn't entirely an accusation. It was almost a question. I didn't know anything, I said. I found out I was named in this will the same way you did. By phone, 2 weeks ago. You haven't spoken to him? Not once. Not in 20 years. Something moved through his expression. He looked away. Then Savannah spoke again, and her voice had acquired an edge that she'd apparently decided to stop hiding. She hasn't been part of this family in over 2 decades. She has no relationship to the business, no knowledge of its operations, no... I'm sorry, but this is simply not... She looked at Harmon. I want to understand the legal basis for a 60% transfer to someone who signed away her business interests in 1998. Harmon folded his hands on the folder. Mrs. Whitfield, Savannah, the 1998 divorce settlement addressed assets that existed at that time. What Raymond built after that settlement was his to distribute as he chose. He chose this. Then he was manipulated. She said it cleanly, like a decision. Or confused. Toward the end, he wasn't always... He was evaluated by 2 independent physicians, Harmon said. He opened a secondary folder and slid a document toward the center of the table. A neurologist and a geriatric psychiatrist, 8 weeks before he signed this document. Both certified full cognitive capacity. The evaluations are notarized and on record. Dr. Elaine Foster conducted the neurological assessment. Her credentials and findings are on page 3 if you'd like to review them. Nobody reached for the document. Caleb was looking at the table again. His jaw was set. He did this deliberately, he said quietly. Not to anyone in particular. Yes, Harmon said. He did. What happened next was the kind of thing you can feel building in a room, the way you can feel a storm in the air before a single cloud appears. Caleb stood up, not violently, not dramatically, just the rising of a man whose body has too much energy in it to remain seated. He walked to the window, stood there for a moment looking out at the Nashville skyline. Then he turned around. She left. His voice was measured, but only just. She left when I was 12 years old. She walked out on this family and she signed away everything, and she's been... Where? In Cookeville? For 20 years? And he gives her the company? He looked at me directly. What did you do? Did you contact him recently? Did you reach out when you knew he was sick? I didn't know he was sick, I said. I didn't know anything about his life. Then explain it to me. His voice cracked very slightly on the last word, and in that crack I heard something that wasn't anger, something younger and rawer that the anger was sitting on top of. Help me understand why he would do this. I can't explain it, I said. I came here not knowing what to expect. I'm as surprised as you are. You're not as surprised as I am. He said it with absolute certainty. Maybe he was right. Savannah stood beside her husband and placed her hand on his arm. She looked at me with an expression I recognized, not hatred exactly, but the look of a person who has identified a variable that threatens an outcome they've already planned for. I want to formally note, she said, that we intend to seek independent legal counsel regarding the validity of these terms. That is absolutely your right, Harmon said. This isn't over, Caleb said. I understand. Caleb sat back down, and the room settled into the particular silence of people who have said the first things and are bracing for what comes next. Harmon reached beneath the table and placed his hand on the tablet in the black case. Before we go further, he said, there's something Raymond asked me to present at this point in the reading. He recorded it approximately 3 weeks before he passed. He was specific about the timing. It was to be shown after the primary bequests were read and before the letter. He looked at both of us. I'd ask that you watch it without interruption. You can say whatever you need to say afterward. Caleb stared at the tablet. Something crossed his face, something complicated and private. Fine, he said. Harmon set the tablet on the table so we could both see it, angled it slightly toward us, and pressed play. The man on the screen was Raymond, but he was Raymond the way I hadn't seen him, or imagined him, in a very long time. Not Raymond Whitfield, CEO of Whitfield Property Group, not the man in the newspaper photographs with the firm handshake and the controlled smile. Not the man Caleb had eulogized at the memorial, the strategic visionary with the unshakable discipline. This was a man sitting in a simple wooden chair in a room I didn't recognize, wearing a blue flannel shirt, his silver hair pushed back from his forehead, his hands resting loosely in his lap. He looked tired. He looked older than I'd expected. But his eyes were clear and steady and entirely himself. The eyes of the man who had played piano at Rudy's Southern Table on a Friday night in 1981 and forgotten to care who was listening. He looked into the camera for a moment before he spoke, as if he was deciding how to begin. Then, if you're watching this, I'm gone. And if both of you are sitting in that room, then things went the way I hoped they would. His voice was quieter than I remembered, but it carried. Caleb, he looked directly into the lens. I know you're angry. I know this doesn't make sense to you right now, and I know you think I've made a mistake. I need you to sit with that feeling for a while before you act on it. That's all I ask. He shifted slightly in the chair. I want to tell you something I should have said out loud a long time ago. Something I told myself I'd get around to and never did, because I was always getting around to the next thing. That was the problem, really. I was always getting around to things. He was quiet for a beat. Your mother built something with me before I knew how to build anything. When we opened the White Note, I had the vision and she had everything else. The books, the numbers, the suppliers, the staff schedule, the tax filings. I used to joke that she was the boring half of the operation. I said it in front of people and they'd laugh and she'd smile and I thought that was fine. His jaw tightened slightly. It wasn't fine. It was me taking credit for a foundation I didn't lay alone. I was gripping the arms of my chair without realizing it. In 1991, the Nolensville project nearly collapsed. Bad numbers, worse timing, and a contractor who'd been double billing for 8 months before anyone noticed. Your mother found it. She'd been going over the books on her own time, unpaid, because she was worried and she didn't want to alarm me until she was sure. He paused. She saved that project. I reported it to the investors as my own discovery. I told myself I was protecting her from the stress of the credit. The truth was, I just didn't think to share it. Caleb had not moved. His hands were flat on the table. She told me once that I was becoming someone she didn't recognize. That was in, I think, the fall of 1992. We were standing in the kitchen on Maple Ridge Drive, and she said it very quietly, like she wasn't asking me to change, just stating a fact she'd finally accepted. I told her she was being dramatic. Raymond looked down at his hands. She was not being dramatic. She was the only person in my life who ever told me the truth, and I spent years interpreting that as criticism instead of care. His voice stayed steady, but it cost him something. When she left, I told myself a story about it. You know the story. I've told it by omission for 20 years. The version where she walked out. The version where I was the one who stayed, who built, who provided. That version made me the center of things, which is where I preferred to be. He looked up. It wasn't true. The truth is that I made our marriage into a place she couldn't stay in. I did that through 100 small choices and a handful of large ones. And by the time she packed her bags, I had already left. I just left without moving. He turned his gaze directly into the camera, and it felt, sitting in that room, like he was looking at something just past the lens, looking at what had been. Dorothy. My name in his voice after 20 years. I owe you more than this. I know that. What I'm leaving you isn't payment. There isn't enough money in the world for that category of debt. It's acknowledgement. It's me saying in the only language I have left, I knew what you were worth, and I chose not to say it while I could, and that is the thing I am most sorry for. He was quiet for a moment. You were the reason the music meant anything. Not because you played terribly for the record. I made a sound that was almost a laugh, but because you listened the right way. You listened like it mattered. And when I stopped playing, you didn't make a fuss about it. You just knew. You knew what it meant, and you let me lose it, because you'd learned by then that I wasn't going to hear you if you tried to stop me. He settled back slightly. The company goes to you because you helped build its foundation, literally and in every other sense. The house goes to you because it was always more yours than mine. And the trust. He paused. I'll let Gerald explain the trust. He looked into the camera one more time. Caleb, I love you. I have always loved you. But I raised you to see the world the way I saw it in my worst years, through the lens of acquisition, of advantage, of what things are worth in dollars and position. I gave you everything I thought mattered and failed to show you the things that actually did. That's my failure, not yours. And I hope... His voice caught very briefly and then steadied. I hope you'll forgive me for it. And I hope eventually you'll understand why I did this. The screen went dark. The silence afterward had a different quality than the silence before. Before, it had been the silence of tension, of people waiting to speak, to argue, to stake claims. This was the silence of something having landed, the silence of words that had gone somewhere they couldn't be called back from. Caleb sat very still. His face was doing something private and difficult. Savannah had her hand on his arm again, but she wasn't looking at him. She was looking at the darkened tablet screen with an expression I couldn't fully read. I looked at my own hands in my lap. The pearl earrings my mother had given me caught the light from the window. You played terribly, for the record. 26 years. That's how long it had been since I'd heard Raymond Whitfield make me almost laugh. Harmon let the silence stand for a full minute before he spoke. There are 2 remaining items, he said. The explanation of the trust and a personal letter which Mr. Whitfield asked me to read aloud. Shall we continue? Caleb nodded without looking up. The Whitfield Family Trust, Harmon said, opening a secondary document, was established on March 14, 2001, in the name of Dorothy Ann Whitfield. At its establishment, it contained an initial deposit of $250,000. Since that date, Raymond Whitfield made quarterly contributions to the trust without exception, in good years and difficult ones, over a period of 23 years. I heard myself say, he opened it in 2001? 3 years after your divorce, yes. And he instructed the trust administrator to make no contact with you until after his death. His written instruction on the matter stated, Harmon found the page and read carefully. She won't accept it if I offer it while I'm living. She'll say she doesn't need it, and she'll mean it, and I'll have to watch her mean it. This way she doesn't get a vote. Savannah turned her head. Caleb looked up for the first time. I sat with that for a moment, the image of Raymond in some office in Nashville, writing those words about me, knowing me well enough to know I would refuse, deciding to wait me out across decades. Stubborn. Absolutely, irredeemably stubborn. Just like he'd always been. He was still making the quarterly deposits as recently as November, Harmon said, 3 months before he passed. I didn't have anything to say to that. I'm not sure there were words in the right shape for it. After a moment, I said very quietly, he never stopped. No, Harmon said, he never did. The letter was 4 pages, handwritten, on cream stationery with Raymond's initials at the top in navy blue. Harmon unfolded it with care and read it in the same steady, unembellished voice he'd used for everything else. Not performing it, just delivering it, which was the right thing to do. I won't reproduce all of it here. Some of it belongs only to the room it was read in. But I'll tell you what it said to Caleb, because it matters. It said, I watched you become the version of me I'm least proud of, and I handed you the tools to do it. I told myself I was preparing you for the world. What I was actually doing was replicating my own blindness and calling it inheritance. It said, your mother is not the woman who left. She is the woman who stayed, in every room that mattered, in every year that was hard. And I spent 2 decades letting you believe otherwise, because the alternative required me to admit what I'd done. It said, you are capable of more than I showed you. I know that because of her. Whatever is good in you came from the years she spent showing up before you understood what showing up meant. Caleb's hands, flat on the table, curled very slowly into fists. Not in anger, or not only in anger, in the way that hands curl when something is passing through a person that's too large for their expression. Savannah had stopped writing. Her notebook was closed. To me, the letter said things I had waited a long time to hear and had stopped expecting. Things about the White Note, and the Nolansville Project, and a specific Tuesday in February of 1992 when I had sat up until midnight helping him prepare a presentation he gave the next morning to a room full of investors, and he had thanked them at the end and said, I've been working on this for months, and I had stood in the back of the room and said nothing. I have lived with the memory of that moment for 30 years, the letter said. Not because you confronted me, because you didn't. Because you looked at me from across that room with an expression I can still see, and then you folded it up and put it away, and we drove home in silence, and you never brought it up. That was the moment I knew I had become someone I didn't want to be. I just wasn't ready to stop being him yet. When Harmon finished reading, he folded the pages back along their original creases and placed the letter in a fresh envelope. He slid it across the table to me. His instruction was that this goes to you, he said. I took it with both hands. Caleb left the room first. He stood, straightened his jacket, that gesture I'd seen him make 100 times, the armor adjustment, and walked to the door. Savannah gathered her things and followed, pausing briefly at the door with her hand on the frame. She looked back at me. I owe you an apology, she said. The words were careful, chosen. For what I said in the waiting room. It was, I understood, genuinely difficult for her to say. Savannah was not a woman who apologized easily or often. I accept it, I said. She nodded once, precisely, and left. I sat alone in the room with Gerald Harmon, who was straightening his folders with unhurried hands, the way a man does when he's giving another person time to find their footing. After a while he said, Are you all right? I thought about it honestly. I think so, I said. I'm not sure I've caught up to it yet. That's normal, he said. Take the time you need. There's no rush on any of the decisions. The trust is already established. The shares transfer automatically. The house is yours as of today. You don't have to decide anything today. The audit, I said. We'll begin appointing the independent firm within 30 days. And if they find something? Harmon met my eyes. Then you'll have a decision to make about the findings. Mr. Whitfield was very deliberate about leaving that decision with you. He wanted it in your hands. I understood in that moment what Raymond had done, not just in the will, in all of it. He hadn't just given me money and a company. He'd given me something more uncomfortable and more significant than that. He'd given me the last word, on the business, on the family, on what happened next, and he'd trusted me to use it the way he hadn't been able to. I picked up the letter from the table and placed it carefully in my bag. I stood and smoothed my dress, and thanked Gerald Harmon. He walked me to the elevator himself. At the door, he paused. He talked about you occasionally over the years, he said. When there was no reason to, when your name had nothing to do with the business at hand, he'd just mention something you'd said, something you'd done back in the early days. He considered his words. He carried you with him. I thought you should know that. The elevator arrived. I stepped in and turned around. Thank you, I said, for all of it. He nodded and the doors closed. I rode down 14 floors in silence. When I walked out of the building and into the late afternoon Nashville air, The sun was dropping toward the hills to the west, and the shadows on the sidewalk were long and golden. I stood on the steps for a moment and breathed. $42 million. A house on Maple Ridge Drive. A company built on a foundation I'd helped pour, returned to my hands 30 years later. And a letter in my bag from a man who had finally, at the very end of everything, found his words. I thought about Nora waiting at home. I thought about the tomatoes on the porch. I thought about the drive back to Cookeville through the Tennessee dark. And then I thought about a piano I hadn't seen in 23 years. And something in my chest, very quietly, came loose. I didn't go straight home. I sat in my car in the parking deck for a long time, the letter in my lap, the engine off, watching the concrete wall in front of me like it might tell me something useful. The sounds of the city came through muffled and distant. A horn somewhere below, the hiss of a bus, the particular white noise of a place that keeps moving regardless of what happens inside its buildings. $42 million. I said it to myself quietly, just to hear how it sounded out loud. It didn't sound real. It sounded like a number from a story about someone else's life. The kind of number that exists in newspaper articles and television programs, not in the lives of women who buy their paperbacks from Goodwill and grow tomatoes in terracotta pots on a rented porch in Cookeville, Tennessee. I thought about calling Nora. I picked up my phone twice and put it back down both times. There was too much to say and not enough shape to it yet. The words hadn't arranged themselves into anything I could hand to another person. So I just sat there. I thought about Raymond in that flannel shirt, sitting in a plain wooden chair, talking to a camera in the full knowledge that he wouldn't be there when the words arrived. I thought about the specific courage of that, the willingness to be honest when honesty can no longer do you any personal good, when the only reason left to tell the truth is because the truth deserves to be told. He had been many things in his life, some of them good, some of them not. But at the end, he had been honest. I decided that counted for something. After a while, I started the car and drove. The 3 weeks that followed were the strangest of my life, and I have had some strange weeks. I went back to Cookeville. I watered my tomatoes. I walked to the end of the road and back every morning. I sat on the porch with Nora and told her everything, which took most of one afternoon and required 2 pots of her coffee and 1 of mine, weak as she always said it was. When I finished, Nora sat quietly for a moment. Then she said, "The man put $42 million in a jar with your name on it for 23 years. "That's one way to put it," I said. "He was stubborn as a fence post." "Yes, so are you." "I know." She picked up her thermos. "Good thing one of you finally blinked." I met with Gerald Harmon twice by phone and once in person during those weeks. He walked me through the mechanics of the trust transfer, the company structure, the property titles. He was patient and clear and never made me feel that any question was too basic, which I appreciated because some of my questions were very basic. I had been a bookkeeper once, a long time ago, and the muscles came back slowly, but they came back. The independent audit firm was appointed on schedule. Harmon didn't tell me details, only that the process had begun and Caleb had engaged his own attorneys in response. The calls between their offices were, Harmon noted with characteristic understatement, active. Caleb called me once, 10 days after the reading. I was in the kitchen making soup when the phone rang and his name appeared on the screen. For a moment I just looked at it, the way you look at a word you've read so many times it's temporarily lost its meaning. I picked up. "Mom." His voice was different than it had been in the office, lower, less structured around its own confidence. "Caleb," a pause. I needed to say something." I waited. "I've been thinking about what he said, in the video." Another pause, longer. "About the way I see people." "I heard it too," I said. "I know you did." He was quiet again. I don't know how to do this in a phone call. I don't think I can do this in a phone call." "Then don't," I said. "Come when you're ready. I'll make soup." He almost laughed. Not quite, but close enough that I could hear the edge of it. "Okay," he said. "Okay, yeah." He didn't come that week, or the next, but he called twice more with small practical questions about the company, questions he could have asked Harmon but asked me instead, and I understood those calls for what they were. A man learning how to be in proximity to his mother again, one careful step at a time. That was enough. For now, that was enough. 3 weeks after the reading, a set of keys arrived by certified mail. They came in a plain white envelope with Harmon's return address, a typed note confirming the property title transfer, and a handwritten line at the bottom in Harmon's own writing. He kept it exactly as it was. I think you'll understand when you see it. I held the key in my palm for a long time, brass, old, slightly worn at the teeth. 44 Maple Ridge Drive, the first home Raymond and I had bought together, the house with the magnolia tree and the kitchen too small for 2 people, and the back bedroom where we had once penciled Caleb's height into the doorframe every year on his birthday, small pencil marks climbing upward, dated in my handwriting, a record of a boy growing in a house where people were still trying. I had not seen it in 26 years. I drove to Nashville on a Tuesday. The street was quieter than I remembered, which was probably just age, mine, not the streets. The houses were well kept and moderately prosperous, the kind of block where people mow on Saturdays and put pumpkins on their porches in October. Several had changed significantly. A few were just as I remembered. 44 Maple Ridge Drive had changed and hadn't. The magnolia was still there, taller than I had imagined, its upper branches reaching past the roofline now, thick with waxy leaves and the memory of every season it had witnessed since Raymond and I had stood in this driveway in 1983 and said, with more hope than certainty, "This is ours." The shutters were navy blue, recently painted. The porch had been extended and refinished. The mailbox was new. But the bones, the low brick facade, the arched front window, the slight slope of the front walk, were exactly as they had always been. I sat in the car for a few minutes. Then I got out, walked up the path, and put the key in the door. Inside, it smelled like lemon polish and old wood, and the particular stillness of a house that has been cared for but not lived in. The floors were refinished hardwood, dark and clean. The walls were painted a soft white. The kitchen had been updated. Granite countertops where there had once been laminate, stainless appliances where there had been harvest gold. But the window above the sink looked out onto the same backyard with the same oak tree in the far corner, and that was enough to undo me slightly. I stood at that window for a while. Then I walked through each room. The hallway where Raymond used to leave his shoes, always on the wrong side of the mat. The bathroom with the deep tub I'd refinished myself with a kit from the hardware store. The small bedroom at the end of the hall, Caleb's room, now empty, repainted, but still carrying its original dimensions. Still the room where I had sat on the edge of a twin bed and read stories to a small boy who wanted the endings changed to make him laugh. I touched the doorframe where the pencil marks had been. They were gone, painted over in the renovations, but I knew exactly where they had been, and I stood there with my hand on the frame and let myself know it. The master bedroom. The dining room where we'd had our first dinner after moving in, sitting on the floor because the table hadn't arrived yet, eating takeout from a Chinese place on Gallatin Road with plastic forks. Then I walked down the hall to the den, and I stopped. In the corner of the room, positioned carefully on a square of dark green velvet laid over the hardwood floor, sat an upright piano. Not a new piano, not a showpiece. The piano from the White Note. I knew it immediately, the way you know something you have loved. Not by inventory, but by recognition, the way a face is known before a name. The same walnut cabinet, darker now with age. The same chip on the upper left corner where a delivery man had caught it on a doorframe in the spring of 1984, and Raymond had sworn at length in a way that made Joy, our college-age employee, have to step outside to laugh. The same worn spots on the keys at middle C and the F above it, where 30 years of hands had played the same notes thousands of times. On top of the piano, propped against the music stand, was an envelope. Raymond's handwriting. My name. I sat down on the bench first. Just sat, without opening anything. My hands in my lap, looking at the keys. He had kept it. After everything. After the White Note was sold. After the marriage ended. After 2 decades of building something new and enormous on top of the ruins of what we'd been. He had kept this piano, brought it here, to the first house we'd shared, and left it waiting. I thought about what that cost. Not in money. In the other currency, the one that doesn't have a name, but that everyone spends and earns and sometimes loses entirely. The currency of what we choose to hold on to when we don't have to hold on to anything. He had chosen to hold on to this. After a long moment, I picked up the envelope and opened it. The handwriting was his, more effortful than it used to be, the letters slightly larger, the hand of a man working against some stiffness, but unmistakably his. The same slight forward lean to every letter, the same way the capital D in my name curled back on itself, like it was thinking about changing its mind. Dot, if you're reading this, you came back. I wasn't sure you would. I hoped you might. I bought this piano back in 2005. The people who took over the White Note were going to dispose of it. Said it was too old, too out of tune, too much trouble. I paid them $200 and hired a truck. I didn't have a good reason for it at the time. I told myself it was sentiment. Maybe it was, but I think the truth is that some part of me knew I wasn't done with it yet, or with what it meant. You told me once. We were sitting on the back step of the White Note after closing. Must have been 1986. Caleb was maybe 6 weeks old. You told me that the reason people love music isn't because it sounds beautiful. You said it's because it tells the truth without needing to use words. I asked you what you meant. You said, when someone plays something real, you feel it in your chest before your brain knows what it is. That's the truth arriving before the explanation. I've thought about that a lot over the years. More than you'd probably believe. You were right about that. You were right about most things. I was just too busy being right about other things to notice. There's a song on this piano that you know. Spring of 1982, on a bench very much like this one, in a room very much like this one. You told me it was too sad. I told you that was the price of loving something honestly. You said, then you must love a lot. I did, Dot. I did. I know I don't get to ask anything of you now. I don't get a response or a conversation or the chance to know what you do with any of this. That's the agreement you make when you wait too long. But if you remember the song, and I think you do, because you always remembered the things that mattered, I'd like to think that somewhere, in some version of things, you might play it one more time. Not for me. For you. For the woman who built something real and deserved to be told so while there was still time. Ray, I folded the letter and held it against my chest for a moment. Then I set it on top of the piano, turned back to the keys, and put my hands where they belonged. I should say here, in the spirit of the honesty Raymond seemed to value at the end, I was never a good piano player. Raymond had tried to teach me in our first year of marriage and concluded kindly but clearly that my gift was not in that direction. I had the ear for music, but not the hands, and after a while I'd stopped trying and settled into the role I was better suited for, the one in the back of the room, listening the right way. But I had learned one song. He'd taught it to me in the spring of 1982, sitting on the bench of the old upright at the White Note before it opened for the day, the smell of coffee and fresh paint in the air, the Nashville light coming through the east-facing windows in long pale bars. He had played it through once, then placed my hands on the keys and guided them, note by note, until the melody was in my fingers, even if it wasn't yet in my confidence. It didn't have a name. We had never given it one. I had always just thought of it as Raymond's song, the one he wrote in the months before we got married, the one that sounded, as I had told him, a little too sad. That's the price of loving something honestly, he'd said. I pressed the first note. It was slightly flat. The piano needed tuning, which Raymond had apparently accepted as part of its character. But the note rang out into the quiet room, and something in my chest responded to it the way your body responds to a smell from a long time ago. Not memory exactly, but the feeling that memory is made of. The second note. The third. My hands were not what they had been at 34. The fingers moved more slowly, more carefully, the way everything moves when you've been alive long enough to understand the value of care. I made mistakes. Hesitated at the transitions, hit a wrong note in the fourth bar and had to find my place again. But the melody held. It came back the way Raymond had said things came back, in the chest before the brain. My hands found the phrases they had learned 40 years ago in a room that no longer existed, and the song moved through the quiet den of 44 Maple Ridge Drive like something that had been waiting to be let out. I played it all the way through. When the last note faded, I sat with my hands still resting on the keys and let the silence come back in around it. I didn't cry. I want to tell you I cried, because that would be the tidy version of this moment, the version that announces itself clearly. But I didn't. What happened was quieter and more total than crying, a kind of interior settling, like something that had been held at an angle for a very long time was finally allowed to rest level. Raymond was gone. That was true, and it was real, and no amount of money or property or acknowledgement would change it. But he had remembered. He had kept the piano and kept the house and kept the trust and kept somewhere inside himself through all the years of becoming someone else, the knowledge of what I had been to him and what he had failed to say, and he had found a way to say it at the end. Maybe that was enough. Maybe it wasn't. I decided, sitting on that bench in the afternoon light of a house I now owned, that I didn't have to resolve that today. Some things don't resolve. Some things just become part of the texture of a life. Present, significant, neither fully healed nor fully wound. I had lived 66 years, and I knew the difference between things that needed answers and things that needed only acknowledgement. This needed acknowledgement, so I acknowledged it, and then I sat up straight and put the letter back in its envelope and took one more long look at the room around me. The piano, the green velvet, the afternoon light across the hardwood floor, before I stood up and went to find out what came next. 6 months later, on a Saturday morning in October, Nora and I drove to East Nashville together. She insisted on driving, which meant we took her ancient Buick, which meant we arrived going about 15 miles an hour below the speed limit, which Nora considered a feature rather than a problem. "I'm observing the scenery," she said when I mentioned it. "The scenery is a highway on-ramp. It's a very nice on-ramp." The building we pulled up to was on a corner on Fatherland Street, a 2-story brick structure with large windows and a new coat of dark green paint on the trim. It had been a dry cleaning shop for 15 years, and before that, in a previous incarnation that the older neighbors remembered, a music venue of some kind. The sign above the door was hand-lettered in cream and gold. The White Note, East. Not a franchise, not a chain, just a room with good light and round tables and a small stage in the corner, and on that stage, tonight and every Friday night hereafter, whoever needed a place to play. The terms of the residency were simple, and Harmon had found them only mildly unusual to formalize. Musicians could apply for a 6-month slot. There was no auditions in the traditional sense, only a conversation, and the single requirement that the applicant be someone for whom this particular room would matter. The cafe charged for coffee and food. The musicians played for free, or for tips, or for whatever the night gave them, because that had always been the point. It was not a profitable venture in the traditional sense. It was profitable in the way that Raymond, at the end of his life, had seemed to finally understand things needed to be. I had funded it from a small portion of the trust. Gerald Harmon had walked me through the numbers with his characteristic patience and noted only once that there were more conventional investments available. I told him I was aware. He said no more about it. Caleb had come by the week the renovation was finished, on a Wednesday evening when the crew had just cleared out, and the place smelled like fresh paint and sawdust and possibility. He stood in the middle of the room with his hands in the pockets of his jacket. Not the power suit this time, just dark jeans and a gray sweater, the kind of clothes he would have worn at 17 before the suits became armor. He looked around for a long time without saying anything. Then, "He would have liked this." "I know," I said. He nodded slowly. He walked to the stage and stood looking at the piano, a new one, a good one, a Yamaha upright that was properly in tune, though I had kept the old White Note piano at the house on Maple Ridge where it belonged. "Mom?" He said it differently than he had in the lawyer's office. Said it the way he had when he was 9 and had something to tell me that he wasn't sure how to start. "I'm here," I said. He turned around. His face had the particular quality of a person who has spent several months quietly revising something fundamental about themselves and is only now finding out whether the revision holds in the presence of what it needs to hold in front of. "I'm sorry," he said, "for the things I said in Harmon's office, for the things for a long time, actually, for a lot of it." I looked at my son, the boy who had climbed into a car at 12 years old with his backpack and his blue hoodie without asking why. The boy who had sat with me on library floors on rainy Saturday afternoons. The one who had learned, slowly and with my partial fault in the teaching, to measure things in a currency that left out most of what matters. "I know," I said. "I'm sorry, too." "You don't have to be." "I know I don't have to be. That's what makes it mean something." He was quiet for a moment. Then he walked across the room and stood in front of me, and he was a head taller than me and had been since he was 15. And he looked at me the way he used to look at me when he was small and the world had done something he didn't understand. Then he put his arms around me. We stood like that for a while in the empty room that smelled like paint and new beginnings in the middle of East Nashville on a Wednesday evening, while the light outside shifted from gold to gray and the city went about its business of being alive. Neither of us said anything. Sometimes you don't need to. That Saturday morning, Nora and I stood outside the White Note East and looked at the sign and the light coming through the windows and the small cluster of people already gathering near the door for the soft opening. A young woman with a guitar case was talking to one of the staff. An older man in a canvas jacket stood reading the menu posted in the window, nodding to himself. 2 college-age kids were taking photos of the sign. "Well," Nora said in the tone she used when she was deeply satisfied but didn't want to make a production of it. "Well," I agreed. She looked at me sideways. "How do you feel?" I thought about that honestly, the way I had tried to do more often in these recent months, answering the question actually asked rather than the more comfortable version of it. How did I feel? I felt like a woman of 66 who had lived a long and complicated life and arrived somewhere unexpected and found, to her own surprise, that unexpected was another word for possible. I felt tired in the way that comes after something has been finished, not in the way that comes from things left undone. I felt, in some way I couldn't entirely name, like the version of myself who had stood at the counter of Rudy's Southern Table in the summer of 1981 with a stack of menus in her hands, watching a man forget to care who was listening. That woman was still in here somewhere, not lost, not buried, just waiting for a room with the right kind of light. "I feel like myself," I said. Nora considered this. Then she nodded once with finality. "Good," she said. "That's the one worth being." She pushed open the door and walked in, and I followed her, and the smell of fresh coffee came out to meet us, and somewhere in the corner of the room the piano was waiting. There are things I know now that I didn't know 6 months ago. I know that acknowledgement, when it comes late, is still acknowledgement, that the timing of truth doesn't cancel its value, even when the timing is imperfect. And it is almost always imperfect. I know that a person can spend 20 years building an empire and still carry, somewhere in their interior, the simpler version of themselves, the one that played piano because it was the only honest thing they knew how to do. I know that children learn what they're shown, and that the best we can do when we've shown them the wrong things is to show up differently. Not to erase, but to add. To say, there is also this. There is also another way. I know that $42 million changes certain practical realities significantly, and that it changes nothing that was already true. I was the woman who laid the foundation before I was the woman who inherited the building. The second fact doesn't create the first. The first was always there. And I know this in the particular way you know things you've paid for slowly over time. That the most important thing Raymond Whitfield ever gave me was not in a will. It was a Tuesday evening in 1984 in the back room of a small cafe in East Nashville. We had been open for 3 weeks. We had barely any money and barely any customers, and we were running on coffee and conviction, and Raymond sat down at the piano after closing and started to play. Not practicing, not performing, just playing. I sat on the counter with my bookkeeping and listened, and at some point I set the books down, and I just listened. And that feeling of something honest happening in a room, of truth arriving in the chest before the explanation, that feeling never entirely left me. I just had to find my way back to a room where I could feel it again. The piano is there. The coffee is ready. The door is open. Come in.